Okay, I have 40 minutes and 10 questions for Nick Kristof, and then you have 10 minutes, so we'll probably be able to take 4 questions for Nick Kristof. There are many reasons why we don't say hard things to each other in marriage, at work, in the public square. There's the fear that you might not be entirely right, and so you might set off a whole mess of consequences without realizing it. There's the fear that you're going to hurt somebody that you're fond of. There's the fear of conflict. There's good old-fashioned conflict avoidance. On Thursday night, you were the first person to say that Biden should step down. I would like to know what your calculus was, and I'd like to know what the cost to you has been.
So, you watch that debate, and how can you think that Joe Biden is going to be the best candidate to take on Donald Trump this fall? And I think that, I've known Biden for years. I admire him, but he's absolutely right when he talks about the stakes of this election and when he talks about Trump as a threat to democracy. And if one takes that view seriously, then I think one has to do everything possible to make sure we have the strongest candidate possible. And so that was the calculus. I must say that I worried that, I think there is a real significant possibility that President Biden does not take that advice and remains in the race, and that all these kinds of criticisms then end up actually weakening him further. And I worry about that. But at the end of the day, I think that paramount concern is, is just getting the strongest candidate we can. As for the cost, look, I'm just back from the Middle East and been writing about Gaza. I have a column just went online about the West Bank, and that has battered more friendships over the last 8 months than anything I'm going to write about Biden. And, I dish it out. You've got to be willing to take it.
Mm-hmm. Did you get blowback from the White House?
The White House did not call. I don't think I'm likely to be going to a state dinner this fall, though. But, I can live with that.
You've stepped out of line before. You've risked your reputation and your employment. You rescued a Chinese dissident.
Yeah. So when I was covering Tiananmen Square with my wife, Cheryl Wudun, we got help from this young Chinese man, a student at Tsinghua University. And because he helped us, and because he helped New York Times readers, he was arrested, he was imprisoned. Then he escaped from prison and came to Beijing and sought help from us. And it was the hardest ethical decision I've ever had to make. A pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent is you don't help escaped felons flee the country. I worried that if we did, that we would get caught, bad things would happen to us, the New York Times bureau would be closed down, we'd be betraying the Times. On the other hand, here's a 19-year-old kid who got in trouble because he helped Times readers. And if we didn't help him, he would at some point get caught. And it was so useful to have Cheryl to think this through with me. And we also, frankly, worried because I'd never heard of somebody escaping from a Chinese prison before. And I worried that this might be entrapment and an effort to kick me out of the country by, filming me helping him. But in any case, we did end up helping him. He was able to get to Hong Kong. The next day, we flew to Hong Kong. We helped him get to the U.S. He's now in the U.S., and it's maybe the most unprofessional thing I've ever done in my career, but it's also one of those that I'm proudest of.
Mm-hmm. Most people who read you probably already agree with you, but also, no doubt, Biden reads you, Trump or his special reading assistants read you. Mike Johnson, Chuck Schumer. Are you ever daunted by the potential influence you have?
I wouldn't say I'm daunted by it. I do periodically wonder to what extent I should be writing to influential people who may be able to change outcomes that I care about. In Darfur, for example, to what extent do I try to nag leaders and needle them to get them to act versus writing for the general public. And, I haven't quite figured that out, but periodically I do, I do insert paragraphs that are really aimed for one or two readers in the White House or, on Gaza. There have been occasional paragraphs that have really been directed to Joe and Jill Biden, or to people on Capitol Hill and so on. But I never quite figured that out, actually. What do you think?
I think it's interesting that you just said that they were aimed at Joe and Jill Biden. Say more about that.
I'm looking for who can influence Joe Biden.
Uh-huh.
Maybe I generalize too much on my own relationship with Cheryl, but but the way to influence me, if you want to get me to do a column about some subject, reach out to Cheryl.
Yeah. You did something, you told a story in Chasing Hope that really impressed me, and it was about a moment of intellectual humility when you realized that you had been condescending about a certain class of people in China. It's very rare to hear that story from people who have a public profile.
This was during the Tiananmen Square democracy movement, and I had been in covering the democracy movement, which of course was 35 years ago this month. I had often written about the workers and the peasants. And I'd said truly condescendingly that, they say they're for democracy, but they can't define democracy. They can't talk about the institutions they would create and so on. And that was all true. But that terrible night when I was on Tiananmen Square in those crowds of protesters and the troops arrived and opened fire on us, the bravest people that night, as I was cowering, as other folks were cowering, the bravest people were these peasants from the countryside who were rickshaw drivers and would pedal out toward the troops whenever there was a lull in the firing, pick up bodies of kids who'd been killed or injured and take them, rush to take them out to the hospitals. And on the Beijing airport road, the troops were coming in that night after dark, truckloads after truckloads of troops to crush the student democracy protesters. And this salt-of-the-earth bus driver saw them coming, parked his bus across both lanes of the airport road to block the troops. And the trucks had to stop. An officer got out, ordered him, move the bus. And the bus driver, he turned off the engine. He had the keys in his hand. He was standing there in the dark. And he said, no. And the officer pulled out his sidearm and pointed it at this bus driver and said, move the bus. And the airport road has this grassy verge on the side with this tall grass. And at that, the bus driver took the keys and he just hurled them into that high grass. And that guy may not have been able to define democracy or to talk about what institutions make it work, but he was risking his life for it. And I think often in this country, we don't fully appreciate the democratic institutions that we've inherited or act strongly enough to affirm them and make them work. And I think, after 35 years, that there's a lot we in this country can learn from people like those rickshaw drivers or like that bus driver about the importance of preserving our institutions, the democratic guardrails, the democratic referees who make it work.
Maybe one of the most remarkable things about you is that you have seen what you've seen and still held on to your optimism. And I wondered when you were telling that story if it's precisely that combination of horror and heroism that you're getting in one glance that allows you to believe that the world is at least 51% good.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. I think there are really two elements. One is that over my career, I've seen astonishing moral and material progress around the world. I think one of the most important things that has happened on our watch in our lifetimes has been an enormous improvement in human well-being, in the prospect that kids will survive, in the prospect that girls will get educated, the influence that women have in households and over raising children. And the other is exactly what you say, that side by side with the worst of humanity, you always find the very best. That was true at Tiananmen. That was true. I was once in this little Pakistani village called Mirwala in the Punjab, and I came across this incredible woman called Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by a village council to be gang raped because of something that her younger brother supposedly had done. And then the village council carried out that order. They gang raped Mukhtar. And the expectation was that Mukhtar was then going to kill herself out of shame. And instead, she prosecuted her attackers. She sent them to prison. And then she used compensation money for the rape to start the first school in her village because she believed that education was the best way to chip away at the misogyny and cruelty and violence that had led to the attack on her. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. How can you be in Mirwala without, sure, noticing the human capacity for evil, but also without noticing that human capacity for strength and resilience and courage and decency?
Right, it's almost like you have to expose yourself to the worst horrors in order to witness these great overcomings.
In this country, we're not fully tested because we don't have warlords rampaging through the streets. When people are tested in that way, then there are some who commit unbelievable acts of cruelty and betray others. But there are many, many who summon these incredible reserves that they may not have been aware of courage and decency, and make enormous sacrifices for those around them.
It's very grown-up work you do. And one of the harder truths that you talk about in Chasing Hope is that sometimes victims lie.
That was one of the really hard lessons from covering Tiananmen, and I've seen it many times since. But, I was on Tiananmen Square when the massacre happened. I knew roughly how many people had been killed. Our estimate was 400 to 800. And then there were immediately these very widespread reports that tens of thousands of people had been killed, that Tiananmen Square was knee-deep with blood and gore and this kind of thing. And it kind of makes sense that if you have witnessed a terrible crime against your side, then you exaggerate and you describe things that you've heard but maybe you didn't witness, but you say you witnessed them. And as journalists, our natural inclination is to be very tough and skeptical of perpetrators of massacres and violence, but to be much more sympathetic and credulous of victims. And in fact, if we want to do good journalism, we have to also be skeptical and tough on victims, because victims lie too. And it's a very hard thing to do when people have suffered, to be skeptical and ask tough questions, try to verify. But that was one of the painful lessons from Tiananmen.
Mm-hmm. You ran for governor of Oregon, and you said that even inside the system, you were shocked to discover that politics is even more dysfunctional than you had already assumed. I wonder if you have come to a theory about why man is so corruptible.
Well, I'd say, first of all, one should be reluctant to take political advice from somebody who managed to run for governor, and because I got kicked off the ballot, I didn't get a single ballot cast in my favor, maybe for the first time anybody ever running. Although Cheryl puts it more gently. She says, this side of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, you're the only person who had an entire political career, never had a person cast a ballot against you. I think we're fundamentally all corruptible, and that's true of journalists as well. And I'm a deep believer that improving outcomes is not so much about sensitivity training and just education. It's about accountability and creating consequences. And I think that was true in domestic violence. That was true in Me Too. That's true of corporate behavior. And I think it is true in politics. And one of the things that I really worry about is the collapse of local news organizations around the country. You know, the New York Times, we have a good business model right now, at least until AI shows up. But meanwhile, 2 newspapers around the country are going out of business. And many of these are places without an effective opposition party. And if you don't have political opposition and you don't have a local news organization to provide accountability, then I think governance really suffers. And that is because of this, this very human desire to make a little more money, to engage in skullduggery, to talk to donors and try to figure out what one can get out of it. And I think the solution to that is not reforming human nature, but is to make sure that there are institutions of accountability.
I just want to thank you for skullduggery. It just doesn't get used enough, In terms of impact on public opinion or on policy, what is the single most gratifying piece of reporting you've done and the single most disappointing in terms of reaction?
I think Darfur was something that, the Darfur genocide was something that really seared me. I made initially what I thought was going to be one trip out to Darfur, and then you see villagers where people have been massacred and bodies thrown into wells to poison the wells so nobody can ever live there. Women not only raped, but then scarred so that everybody will know that they are rape victims. And it's a long way away. We didn't have a lot of leverage, but because of journalism of a bunch of people and the work of nonprofits, there was this enormous Save Darfur movement. And there are hundreds of thousands of people alive in Darfur because a bunch of people around the U.S. cared and put pressure. And then there were first African Union peacekeepers and then UN peacekeepers and pressure on trying to slow the arms trade to Darfur. And it was imperfect, and there were hundreds of thousands who still died, but there are hundreds of thousands who are alive. And I played some small role in that, and that was really exciting. In terms of, there's so many, Iraq was incredibly depressing. I spent so much time both in Iraq before our invasion, trying to jump up and down and saying, look, the Iraqis, many of them hate Saddam Hussein, but they also hate the idea of a U.S. invasion. They see the U.S. through this prism of suspicion that we're going to take their oil, et cetera. We're going to establish bases. And those columns just had essentially no impact. And that was enormously frustrating just to watch us in slow motion as we engaged in what I thought was a horrific policy failure that was disastrous for Americans and Iraqis alike.
You mentioned that things were imperfect, that you can't achieve always at the level that you hope to. That's another very grown-up part of your job. I am actually physically anxious about a Trump second term, but I'm also a little worried about what happens if Trump loses. And I wonder if you think January 6th is the worst it can get, or if it was a warm-up act.
So it's not the worst that it could get, and that if you had if Michael Pence had not done what he did, then we would have had some real risk of civil conflict, of parts of the country splitting apart. And I think that Congress passing the Electoral Count Act and clearing up the process for counting electoral votes, I think that helped a lot. I think that reduced that risk. But it's not impossible that what happened in 1876 and what almost happened in January 2020, that happens again. That would be my biggest fear. I must say, though, that as I look at the risks of Trump losing versus the risks of Trump winning, okay, I'll take the risks of him losing.
And we must be more ready for some kind of domestic disturbance, some kind of insurrection.
I think so, and I do think that Congress clarifying what it means to count electoral votes, and you can't just have alternative slates ponied up here and there. I think that helps a lot.
So that goes to systems. So I was thinking about storytelling conventions like heroes and villains and turning points, but I think most of our lives are lived inside systems, like the healthcare system or the justice system or the electoral college system. I wonder if there's a system that gives you hope, that's been corrected in a way that makes you optimistic that other systems needing correction might be so corrected.
Well, after Trump's election, then there were a lot of institutions that actually really did their job pretty well. Lawyers, who would have ever thought lawyers would be regarded as heroes in America? But in general, the institution of law did, I think, a very good job. I think a lot of journalists, I think we in journalism, I think we blew the 2016 election, but I think after that election, I think journalists were pretty good in trying to hold the Trump administration accountable. I think there were a lot of folks in the government who did a pretty good job of trying to adhere to the rule of law. And, it was imperfect, but we did manage to get through. And I must say the military, the U.S. military, a lot of folks there, under enormous pressure, managed to uphold the traditions and values and independence of the U.S. military. I think one reason to be concerned about a Trump victory next time around is that I think he learned a lot of lessons and learned the importance of choosing the aides who will actually do what he wants done, even if that may violate the Constitution.
What system is most in need of correction in the United States?
One of the things that concerns me the most has been, so I come from a little farm town where good jobs went away and meth arrived, and a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And I don't think this country has nearly come to grips with that human catastrophe across the country of addiction, of alcoholism, of suicide. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was important, but every 2.5 weeks we lose more Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide than we lost from 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when working class Americans feel angry and despairing and turn to Trump, then it's not just because of bigotry and racism. It is because they genuinely have been betrayed in many cases. They have a right to be angry. And so I would love to see much greater efforts to address this kind of crisis in working class America that I don't think educated America has come to grips with. I think we've been much too quick to point fingers rather than offering helping hands. We have a robust discussion about how to improve college access, but we don't fully acknowledge that 1 in 7 American kids doesn't graduate from high school. If you don't graduate from high school in America today, you are cooked. Your kids are cooked. And I think that there has been a real failure in our world of educated, I'm presuming a little bit here, but often, liberal Americans in neglecting this humanitarian crisis we have right here at home.
Would you chalk that up to lack of proximity? Like, is it just too easy to live every day of your life without really interacting with anyone who hasn't graduated from high school, without interacting with anyone who isn't living on a street?
One of the puzzles has been that poor Americans, low-income Americans, the bottom of 20th percentile, are more generous in charitable donations in terms of the share of income they donate than the top 20%. And why is that? It's not that if people who are affluent are intrinsically, less inclined to be generous. It's precisely this issue of lack of association. that if you are affluent in America today, you probably live in an affluent community. You are in an affluent school district, and your kids' friends are reasonably well off as well. You're intellectually aware of needs, but it's not something that hits you every day. And so you donate to your business school to gold plate the toilets, or you donate to, your church or synagogue or whatever it may be, which also has an affluent congregation, or to the opera, whatever it may be. Meanwhile, if you're a poor American, then you can't deduct, you don't itemize deduction, so you don't get the tax benefit. But you see all around you those needs, and as a result, you dig deeper in your pockets. And I think and there have been some research that indeed it shows it is this question of proximity that you raise. And I think that if we could figure out more ways of mixing up the country, maybe through national service, through exchanges, not just with, Indonesia or Europe, but with poorer parts of America, then we would understand that, so much of outcomes isn't just hard work and obeying the law and being smart, although all those matter. But so much of it is, the most important decision we ever make is when we choose the parents we're born to. And if you don't win the lottery when you were born, in terms of the family you're born to, then you're going to be struggling. If you're in foster care, you've got a roughly 2% chance of graduating before your college. That's a totally broken system. And so I wish we could figure out more ways of addressing that kind of proximity question. And I do think some exchange and national service programs are one step toward that.
Yeah. I did a lot of fundraising for Children's Hospital Oakland in my day. And you know how they always have the levels, like you give $25,000, you're a legend, and if you give $10,000, you're an icon. And I wanted to do it by percentage of income. I wanted to say if you give 1% of your income, you're a legend.
I love that idea. I love that idea.
Because it's too easy for really filthy rich people to give $25,000, and everyone walks around saying, I can't believe you gave $25,000. Meanwhile, it's the equivalent of $1.
I'd love to see naming rights go to some fireman who donates 1% of his income.
Totally. And to have them right in there on that list together would be kind of amazing. Okay, so this is going to be my last question. I'm going to turn it over to you guys, but take your time on this one. You're an optimist and a writer. Tell us a story, preferably with lots of convincing details, of how we get from this moment to a winning ticket and then to a place of stability where the boys aren't so proud and no one in the White House is praising Putin or selling off the environment to oil and gas executives, where women, from porn stars to every one of us here, are safe from being grabbed, and 50,000 career civil servants can contribute quietly and professionally to the work that actually makes America great. Make it good.
It is a bit of a challenge.
I know.
In some ways, it's easier to be optimistic about Tanzania or Ghana than it is about the challenges we face right here. But look, I think there is probably a better than even chance that Donald Trump wins in November. And I say that in part not just because of what is happening here, but if you look at Europe, Macron is about to, looks like, catastrophically lose an election there. Justin Trudeau is incredibly unpopular in Canada. The Japanese, there is this real rebellion against elites, against national leaders, and I think that that is rippling through the U.S. as well.
Can I pause and ask?
Yeah.
You do not think he'll step down?
I wish he would. I think it is probably unlikely. I would not bet on it. And, I think he's, I think self-selection process that people who run for office tend to be to really believe in themselves, to believe that they're going to win, to have a lot of self-confidence. And I think that is true of Joe Biden. I fear that he is more wounded by the kind of critiques that I wrote and that others wrote than, thinking them through. I hope that Jill and others will influence him, but I would bet that will not happen. And so I suspect he will be the nominee.
Can I ask one more interruption question? There's no way to force him to step down. It must be voluntary.
That's essentially correct. Yeah. And, if the polls in the next couple of weeks show that the debate really wounded him enormously and he's in desperate shape, then I think there'll be more pressure from other folks in the Democratic Party to ask him to step down, partly because everybody's going to be worried about what's going to happen in Senate races and House races. And if we were to lose the White House and the Senate and the House, boy, can you just imagine? I mean, that would be just a catastrophe. And I think that might indeed happen. And so if the polling numbers are really awful, then maybe you'll see more pressure from Capitol Hill. But I would be surprised if Biden were to withdraw, which makes it even more challenging to come up with the optimistic scenario you want. But look, who thought that after Trump's grab 'em video, the Access Hollywood video, who thought that he would ever have a chance of winning? Politics is unpredictable. It's a long way till November. The economy shows some hints of possibly improving. I think that will help Biden. It's also possible that as we get closer to November and people focus a little bit more on the election, on risks of chaos, that it's possible that more of them will break for Biden. And if Biden were to win, then I think there's a real prospect that the Republican Party, or more elements of it, will come to their senses. And having lost a series of elections, that they will move, I think this is Liz Cheney's theory of politics. They will come back to something closer to what they were, but with more of a focus on working class and less educated Americans, which would be just fine. So I think that is possible, although not entirely likely. I must say that, I think that the way in the long run to improve our outcomes has got to be a broader focus, not just on politics, but on addressing some of these enormous gaps in America and the sense among so many Americans that they have been betrayed by both parties. And as I said, that's not entirely fanciful. I see so much through the lens of my hometown and the suffering there and the dysfunction there. The 5 kids who got in the school bus right after me each morning were the 5 Knapp kids. Farland Knapp was my year in school. And smart kid, his brother is Zealand, his brother Nathan, their sister Regina, and their baby brother Keelan. And none of them graduated from high school. When jobs went away, they struggled. And then Farland died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use. And baby brother Keelan died right at the beginning of the pandemic from an overdose. Their mom is alive in her 80s, walks up the hill every day to visit the graves of her 5 dead children. And my friends not only suffered greatly, they inflicted great suffering on others. Somebody who's written a lot about sexual violence. One of the things that I really struggled with was 2 boys on my old school bus. 2 were later convicted of raping very young girls and sent to prison. How can that be? One bus, 2 boys. And I look back, and we as taxpayers spend an enormous amount of money incarcerating my friends. I think if that money had been spent dealing with their childhood traumas, educating them, giving them a skill or a trade so they could compete, that would have been so much more effective. And I look back, and I think about the Naps dropping out of school one after the other, and so many others doing this. And I think, what were the adults thinking at that time? But then I look at how many kids are living in dysfunctional homes today. 1 in 7 American kids is living in a home with a parent with an addiction. And I think, what are American adults thinking today when they tolerate these kinds of levels of dysfunction and don't invest adequately in education from the earliest years on up to higher education? And in the long run, I think if we're going to have a healthy democracy, then we need to have a healthier society, which means giving people some sense of hope, some sense that they can compete in the labor market. And that, there's no perfect way of doing that, but I think education is the best single path to doing that. And we, as a country, have largely failed to make those investments for the people who most need it. We invest in our kids' education. We don't invest in education as a whole for those who most need it. And that is our failure.
Per that point, is there an investment or a piece of legislation around education that you could imagine passing in a Trump administration that could help?
So I don't think it's probably going to happen at the federal level, because I think federal level is largely paralyzed. But I think it is actually beginning to happen at the state level. And Jim and Donna Barksdale are right here. And, what they and others managed to do in Mississippi is kind of extraordinary in terms of getting 3rd graders to read and dramatically improving K through 12 outcomes. And what I find exciting about that is, look, Mississippi did not solve childhood poverty. It did not solve racism. But even with those impediments, they did solve 3rd grade reading. And that means the rest of the country just has no excuse for our failures. And, I was just mentioning to Jim and Donna, in the Mississippi Delta, one of the poorest places in the country, was at an entirely African-American high school where the principal talked about a 97% high school graduation rate. And I just didn't believe it. And then I looked at the numbers, and they were right, and I was still skeptical. So I tried to understand how this could possibly be true. And I found an example where there was a girl from that school who had dropped out because she had a single mom who was the only wage earner, and the mom had had a health crisis and couldn't work anymore. The family had no income. This girl felt she had to drop out to get a job. And 3 people from that school were then assigned to reel that girl back into high school. And they talked to her, they talked to her mom, they talked to her relatives in town, all to kind of lean on her. They went to her employer, this restaurant that had just hired her, and they convinced the restaurant to give her work hours in the evening and on weekends so she could still be at school. And they got her back into school. And that is something that any state can do to fight for these kids. And there's some signs that is happening, that we are doing a better job at the state level. Look, if Mississippi, whoever thought that we would be inspired by education in Mississippi? But we can be today. And if Mississippi can accomplish this, then any state can. No state has an excuse for not doing better. And thanks a lot, Jim and Donna, for your leadership on that.
I love you. Is that appropriate to say? We have 10 minutes for questions right here, and there's a microphone coming right down to you in the blue shirt.
Thank you for a great conversation. Back to the election. In all of the conversations that we've had, particularly in the last 2 days, so infrequently, in fact, I can't remember a time any of us have talked about the potential strength of the Biden-Harris ticket. It's what is it about the combination of them that makes you hopeful or not? Or let's say it another way, why is it that she is not spoken of more frequently in all of these conversations?
Why Vice President Harris has not
Yes.
spoken of more?
Yes.
So I think it's two things. I think that the polling on Vice President Harris has not been terribly encouraging. It's done a little bit better lately, but she has been seen as a weakness rather than a strength for the ticket. Though I think that perception is changing to some degree over the last 6 months. And the other is that in policy terms, I think the feeling among people who, both who work in the White House and those who have interactions with them, is that she is a more effective communicator, but that she has not been solid on policy. And I think one bit of evidence for that is that the White House has been very reluctant to make her available to journalists for conversations, that they're afraid of what she's going to say in these conversations. And I think that is, I think that too is changing. I think she's become more solid on policy. I think actually on Gaza, she's been a quite helpful voice in the White House. I think she's got a very good national security advisor who has been helpful. And so I think she's become better on the policy side, but from a low base, and better on the politics electability side, also from a low base. But I think that is fundamentally the driver. And, from my point of view, if I try to think who can win the race for Democrats in the fall, I don't think that somebody should have an automatic ticket just because they're the vice president any more than Joe Biden did in 2016. And I think that, look, Michigan is a must-win state for Democrats. Gretchen Whitmer is governor there. I think she's proven herself pretty electable among centrist voters. So, I tend to think of somebody like her as largely for electability reasons. That's my take.
Ms. Brown.
Fabulous, fascinating, and inspiring, the two of you together just now. Nick, you're amazing. There was a lot of back and forth, in the debate about veterans. Who did they like more, who'd done more for them, etc. What kind of impact do you think frankly, I think, shameful exit from Afghanistan had?
About what?
The shameful exit from Afghanistan, when we pulled out of Afghanistan with all of that chaos.
Yes.
Do you think that there was a bitterness in veterans about the way that happened? Because I've spoken to many people in the military who feel very bitter about that exit. And how do you think veterans are feeling about these candidates, the ones that you've spoken to?
In terms of the exit from Afghanistan?
Well, in terms of how veterans feel about Trump and Biden, and whether the Afghanistan exit impacted their feelings about Biden.
I think probably like you that the Afghanistan exit was a foreign policy catastrophe in every which way. I must say that I'm probably more sympathetic to the idea of the troop pullout from Afghanistan than you are. It felt to me as if the war in Afghanistan was unsustainable and that it wasn't good for women or girls in Afghanistan either, just to have the war continuing. And so I was sympathetic to the idea of a pullout. There was clearly horrific failure. I mean, I think the White House would argue it's an intelligence failure. I think the Intelligence Committee would say it was a political failure. But, there was this expectation that the government was going to hang on much longer and there was going to be time to get people out, et cetera. And that did not happen. I think there was also an expectation that Taliban would not be as ruthless and brutal as it turned out to be. Though, again, I think that was that was a real misjudgment. I just don't think, though, that catastrophe is going to affect the outcomes of voters so much. And the political outcome, I think that in terms of foreign policy, I think Biden is hurt somewhat more by the Gaza war, and I think most of all about just some of these domestic issues, often unfairly, the inflation. 2 days ago, I was chatting with this woman who was undecided. She doesn't like either Biden or Trump, and she said that she'll vote really based on who's going to improve her economic circumstances. And I think she's sort of fairly typical. She, her husband died from an overdose. She's got a son who is using and is homeless, and she just feels that nobody really cares about these kind of economic struggles that she is facing. She's just very cynical. And I think that whoever can reach out to her and make her think that they're going to help her live better, and Biden does get, much better than the media. Like we in the media, we never talk about, the insulin price cap. Boy, the insulin price cap, that matters for a lot of Americans. And bandwidth in rural areas. So I do think he gets it to some degree, but I think his boy has had trouble communicating it. That's kind of my take on that.
Well, that goes to this horrible truth, which is that just because you can communicate something convincingly doesn't mean that you're going to do one thing about it once you're president.
Well, and
You could just look right at the camera and say, I'm for veterans, I'm going to make sure you have your health care, and then get inaugurated and never touch it.
And one of my seventh grade crush is, she's very.
You're still talking about your seventh grade crush?
Well, she's a very dear friend, and she, of Cheryl and me, I should hurriedly add. But she is very pro-Trump. But why is it? It's because, she lost 4 members of her family to suicide. She once put a gun to her head. She was homeless 7 years because of drug and alcohol abuse. And then finally Trump came along and he said, I'm going to bring those factory jobs back. And then he pointed to scapegoats and said, you should blame these immigrants, et cetera. And she felt finally somebody's speaking to her. And it just breaks my heart that the person she perceives as speaking to her is a demagogue. And that she is now believing in conspiracy theories and thinks that, COVID vaccines will damage her, will hurt her. But we have to do a better job reaching out to voters like Mary. And a starting point is to be less condescending, to be less inclined to dismiss people like her as racist and bigots. It's really hard to win votes from people whom you're calling bigots. And so I hope that, in the coming months we can do a better job reaching out to them and make them feel that we are talking to them as well.
Sometimes I think he who understands behavioral psychology wins.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that.
We have time for one more question. How about right there?
If John Lewis was with us today, and he was a young leader in '65, what would he advise the Democratic Party to do?
What would John Lewis, if he were a young leader today, what would he advise the Democratic Party to do? So I think of John Lewis as somebody who managed to push the Democratic Party to address issues of justice and equity, but also to be, not to go over the top in terms of ideology, and that it's not just about, that politics is substantive, not performative. And I think that one of the Democratic Party's challenges, particularly on the West Coast, has been that we so rule the roost in cities on the West Coast, from San Diego through LA, through San Francisco, through Portland, Seattle, that it becomes all about performance rather than actual outcomes. And there is this incredible gulf between our values and our outcomes. One of, in Oregon, we have one of the lowest high school graduation rates in the country. Our K through 12 outcomes are actually behind Mississippi's. And we took money out of the education budget to put tampons and pads in every school, in every boys' restroom in schools, including kindergarten boys' restrooms. And when you're putting tampons in kindergarten boys' restrooms, that veers into self-caricature. And I think that there is a certain amount of that, especially in West Coast Democrats. And I think that Lewis would be pushing Democrats to focus on outcomes, to focus on justice, and to focus on connecting to working class voters of color and not of color, and to do what we can to try to improve those outcomes, to knit them together with the rest of the country, with the rest of society, but do it in a way that will help them and also help politically. And I think that's a pretty good lesson for the Democratic Party today.
I want to encourage you to buy this book and read this book, and you can have it signed by Nick shortly after we're finished here. Thank you
Thank you
so
for a great
much
conversation.
for your work. You're amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.